Hey, everybody. I am over the moon excited to share this interview with you with Dr. Eben Alexander. You might know his name. He was 40 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. He became more brain dead than arguably any human being ever has and made a full recovery. And God's got a sense of humor. He also is a brain surgeon. So he knows the state that his brain came to, which was basically a pussy container of mush. And yet in that state, he had clear, vivid experiences of heaven and what that journey was like. The book is Proof of Heaven, and this is my interview with Dr. Eben Alexander. Hey guys, studies are showing that 68% of people that watch podcasts regularly don't click the subscribe button. Do me a huge favor. If you like this content, click subscribe so other people know where to go for the cool stuff. Thank you. Hey, everybody. It's Dr. Tara Perry. Welcome to Next Level Healing. I am so excited at having my guest today. He is an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years who had an outstanding near-death experience. His name is Eben Alexander. I'm sure you've perhaps already heard of him. He was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I believe, 40 weeks. He spent 15 years at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School in Boston. In 2008, he experienced this transcendental near-death experience and had a week-long coma that had an inexplicable brain infection associated with it that completely transformed his worldview. And if you're not already on this world awareness, welcome. It's wonderful. I literally cried when I read his book because the implications of what this means for all of us is absolutely tremendous. He is a pioneering scientist and modern thought leader in emerging science that acknowledges the primacy of consciousness in the universe. This is very exciting. This is your consciousness not being located in your brain. And God's got a sense of humor, because what better person to be more brain dead for a week than anybody on planet Earth and come back and write about it than academic neurosurgeon Eben Alexander. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Well, Tara, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
You know, are you taking young pills? Because I've seen you on other interviews and you look younger now than you did then. Or has this world transformation just hooked you up to all that is and you just keep getting younger?
Well, I think almost dying can do a body good. And in fact, I'm now 15 years out. Yesterday was my 15th anniversary of waking up from coma, from that week-long coma.
Wow.
And I must confess, I also meditate daily using sacred acoustics, binaural beats, brainwave entrainment. And I'm convinced that meditation is a beautiful key to kind of coming into wholeness and healing aligned with kind of our soul's purpose. And that helps me stay young. Plus, my oldest son is a fitness used to be a fitness instructor. Now he's a very accomplished physical medicine and rehab healer. But he's given me some workouts, and I try and stick to those workouts. And I think that is another thing that kind of keeps me feeling pretty good. So luckily it seems to show.
So I'd love to share with our listeners what it's like to go from a materialistic worldview, very accomplished. You had so much going on in your life that was beautiful and wonderful, a beautiful family, a beautiful community, a beautiful career that allowed you to help others. But in dying for a week and completely losing consciousness of Eben Alexander, you emerged from that a remarkably different human being. Would you share with our listeners what that was like? And then we're going to have to take a moment and just share with our listeners what your actual story was like.
Okay. Well, I think, it's important to point out this is the biggest gift of my life. And I mean, who can say that a week in coma due to a severe bacterial meningoencephalitis that should have killed me was a tremendous gift? Well, it absolutely was. And of course, my journey has shown me how the hardships in life are often the greatest gifts. And it's how we deal with the hardships and how we manifest our free will I kind of recover that sense of belonging and being part of the universe at large, all bound together through love. These are all concepts that, before my coma, I didn't really appreciate so much. I think it should be important to point out that my adoptive father, and yes, I was adopted. That's a huge part of the story, but we'll get into that later. My adoptive father was tremendously influential in my life. He was a combat surgeon in the Second World War, spent 2.5 years in the Pacific Theater. I still have at my bedside his little pocket Bible, the New Testament and Psalms that he carried with him all through his time in the war. And I think that's one of the reasons he came back to this world was he basically knew God was real. He believed in heaven. He believed in love. He used it in his career as a neurosurgeon. He was a chairman of a top neurosurgical training program, very scientific. And yet for him, there was never any conflict whatsoever in his strong belief in God and in his knowing of the reality of modern science. Now, like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I kind of struggled. I wanted to believe everything he taught me and that I learned in that Methodist church in North Carolina. But in that 20-plus year career in academic neurosurgery, including 15 years at Harvard Medical School, I really had difficulty seeing how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. To me, that was a real mystery. And in fact, as I tell in the book Proof of Heaven, I really went through a dark night of the soul for the last 8 years before my coma. That dark night of the soul was triggered in the year 2000 because my oldest son, Eben IV, was doing a school project in family genealogy. And he said, "Dad, you got to find out more about your birth family." So I had looked into that in my 20s and then given up because the children's home kept saying, your birth mother's not looking for you, so forget about it. But now I sent another letter to the children's home, and this is all there in Proof of Heaven, but it turns out in February 2000, I found out driving down a road in a blizzard, taking my son to go skiing, from a social worker who I'd requested information from. And before this, they'd been very kind of scant about any information about my birth mother, birth family, what have you. And what I found out that day was my birth parents got married. I cannot tell you what a shock that was. I always thought I was looking for my birth mother, but that my birth father had disappeared from the scene.
And this is important because you had this empty hole inside of you that felt incomplete without this connection to your actual family biologically.
Absolutely. And that's a tremendous part of this story at many different levels. I had struggled through my life, I think, with a very kind of subconscious doubt that I was even worthy of love. If my own mother had left me behind when I was 11 days old, and then she wouldn't sign the papers to let me go. It was kind of a trick of social services to get me anyway. But she wouldn't sign the papers till I was 4 months old. So that condemned me to almost 4 full months living in a baby dorm in Greensboro, North Carolina, in the children's home. And so that's where that came from. Now, I'm not looking for any pity whatsoever because I could not have been more blessed in terms of the family I was adopted into. 3 wonderful sisters, the older one adopted, the younger 2 were biological children of my adopted parents. But anyway, that was kind of what I went through. And then that dark night of the soul was because the social worker said they got married, they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. They're still grieving her loss, so it's not a good time to come back in their lives. I didn't realize it, but that kicked me over the abyss. And then from the year 2000 until my near-death experience in 2008, I quit taking my sons to church, believing in a loving, powerful God, saying prayers at night. It all just disappeared. I gave up. I would say agnostic, not atheistic, but agnostic. I didn't know, but I didn't claim to have any evidence there was a loving God out there looking after me at all. And then it turns out that a year before my coma, 2 of my adopted sisters walking on a beach in South Carolina said, "Don't you think it's time you reached out for your birth family again?" My first thought was no, because I remembered how it kicked me off the cliff in 2000. But they were right. So I sent another letter. This time I got a positive response on all of that unfolded beautifully. And of course, that was a necessary step. That was 1 year before my coma. And then, of course, what happened is deep in the coma, it turns out that story, that lost sister, etc., became extremely critical parts of the unfolding reality of my journey. So all a tremendous gift. But I was a materialist neuroscientist going up to that coma time. I had kind of given up on that faith and, any knowledge of God or faith and prayer. And I think a dark night of the soul can be very helpful
And
because
who would have
then,
thought that your gift would have come in the form of an extremely rare gram-negative bacterial meningitis that is unheard of for a healthy adult man to get. But as God does have a sense of humor, and it's so often you hear of people that have been through horrible things, and when they can turn the corner and see it as a gift, then all of a sudden the lights go on. And tell us how that whole thing unfolded for you, because one moment you were being a famous doctor and needed everywhere, and the next moment your brain turned to mush.
I went. I switched sides. I became the patient, and I must say, I've known other doctors. Sometimes our best lessons in terms of being a healer, a physician, come from our own illness. And for me, that is absolutely true. So it all started November 10th, 2008, 4:30 in the morning. Severe headache, backache, really took me over very quickly. Within 3 hours, I was going into deep coma, grand mal seizures, lying on my bed at home. There's a myth out in the lay press about this by, an irresponsible journalist who claimed that this was a medically induced coma. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a coma caused by severe meningitis that afflicted all lobes of my brain stem. All of that was in deep trouble from day one. And that is all made clear in a medical case report that came out in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018.
And how rare is that for a healthy adult male to get that kind of problem?
Well, somewhere in the, one in millions. I don't know the exact number, but E. coli meningitis almost always happens in newborns. About the only way it's been seen to happen in adults is when you have some kind of a neuro procedure and there's a contamination of E. coli during that surgical procedure. But I hadn't had any procedures at all. So that was a huge mystery for my doctors. Where in the world did this E. coli meningitis come from in a 54-year-old white male?
And then as rare as that is, how much even rarer is it for somebody to wake up after 7 days of this and to make a full recovery, which you've done, right?
Exactly. And in fact, that is the point of that medical case report. It's by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson, September 2018, Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. And that case report makes it very clear that my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination. There was far too much damage to my neocortex, my Glasgow coma scales, neurologic exams. Every bit of it was very dire. In fact, my doctors estimated I went from a 10% chance of survival early in the week down to a 2% chance of survival at the end, but with no chance of recovery. That's why they were recommending that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, to stop the antibiotics, take me off the ventilator, let nature take its course, and let me go. And of course, it was a few hours later, I started waking up, coming back to this world. But as I was fighting the ventilator and then they took the tube out, they were shocked. How was I waking up like this? I was thanking them, and then literally within half an hour or so, as my younger sister told me, although I don't remember this, I was sitting on the bed, she said, like a little Buddha, looking at everyone around me, family, friends, self-care workers, and I would look at them in the eyes and I'd say, "Don't worry.
Wow.
All is well."
Oh my goodness, that's so beautiful.
And that from someone who was coming out of a coma that was supposed to kill them. But you're right. And so the points made in that case report, for one thing, this could not have been a dream or hallucination because my brain was far too ill to have harbored any such thing, much less the most profound, robust, memorable, transformational set of events of my whole life.
And that's what's so exciting about all these stories, when people's brain either gets vastly diminished, whether it's through meditation or a coma or, deep meditation, advanced meditation, but the reality gets clearer and vivid in a way that's more vivid than this shadow world that we're apparently living in.
You are correct. But I was going to say the second major point of that paper, the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the journal said, wait a minute, this case is unprecedented. How do you all explain this recovery that seems so miraculous? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's it. They knew of other cases of severe illness, like Anita Morjani's of stage 4 lymphoma, that she basically cured by having a profound NDE, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, brought to the surface dead, but they resuscitated her. She ended up with a full recovery. She'd had a profound near-death experience. The big lesson to all of us is that our spiritual nature is there to help us connect with the universe in ways that can be tremendously healing and bring us into wholeness. And that is something that my journey has shown me very clearly. And that's one of the reasons that I try to share it so broadly with others. But getting back to the story, if you'd like to hear kind of where it went from there. So diving deep into coma, important to point out that one of the unusual features of my NDE, in fact, I've never heard of this as an NDE feature for others in such an extreme measure, was my amnesia. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. I had no knowledge of our language, of humanity, of Earth, of this universe. It truly was an empty slate. And I only realized in the months and years after my coma how important that empty slate was. And it was really to allow me to accept the ultra reality of it because it really happened, as opposed to trying to dismiss it. And that's why I had to have all these lessons about memory, about kind of life experience, life reviews. All that was in this gigantic generic form that couldn't really refer to Eben Alexander's memories of life. And again, that has a tremendous amount to do with where it went and the proof of this guardian angel, because it started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive course on responsive realm. Like being
Actually,
a dirty
I'd like to just pause on that for a moment, because when I actually thought I had read your book years ago, and it was my podcast manager that submitted a list to me and said, here, these would be great interviews for you. And I looked at your name and I thought, I read that book, and I remember this space that you were in that's a bit unusual for NDEs, that
Yes.
worm's eye view, and I'd love you to talk some more about that. And so I went back and I read your book again, and I was so I guess when the student is ready, the teacher arrives, because I must have been reading your book on the 405, in traffic, listening to it, not really hearing it. Because when I went through it a second time, I mean, I was in tears multiple times by the spiritual implications of it. It's deeply moving, and the implications are phenomenal. But yes, please tell our audience about this worm's eye view that you were stuck in for a while.
Yeah, the earthworm's eye view. It seemed to go for a long time. And I would tell people, don't worry. It's not, it sounds kind of difficult as I describe it. Because of my amnesia, I had no fear. And so I just accepted this is the way things are. Now, there's much more of the story that I'll get to in a minute, but to get to your question, initially after I woke up, I was trying to share the story with my doctors, but they said, forget about it. The dying brain plays all kinds of tricks.
Like you would have said before you experienced this.
Right? Exactly. I must confess, I would have. But the interesting thing is I originally thought, well, given the extreme damage to my neocortex, because I was just beginning to go through my medical records and talk it over with my physicians, and found out just how ill I was. I mean, that brain was in no shape to have a dream or hallucination, much less what I did experience. And so I thought maybe the reason my memories disappeared was because of all that damage to the neocortex, still harboring my older view that the brain is where we store memories. In fact, as we discuss in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, many in the kind of neurosurgical world, at least, are realizing we don't store memory in the brain at all. It's the last nail in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that memories are not stored in the physical brain. They're accessed through the physical brain, but that's not where they reside. And that comes from knowledge of more than a century of brain operations, removing brain here, there, and everywhere, including hemispherectomies, where half the brain is removed in young children who have severe seizure disorders. And yet you never find an example of brain resection associated with long-term memory loss. It doesn't happen. There are ways to damage a conversion of short-term to long-term memories at the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe, but that has nothing to do with where they're stored ultimately.
I love the analogy of it's like a TV set. So the brain is the hardware, and the consciousness is that frequency that the TV picks up.
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. We often say, kind of in modern neuroscience, that it's a filter or a transceiver. They used to use the term in the late 1800s, a reducing valve. because we have a tendency to compare any modern technology to what we think the brain is doing. And I'll tell you, the brain is no more like a steam engine, which was the analogy for the reducing valve, than it is like a digital computer. Forget about it. They're completely different. But anyway, so my thinking early was because of the damage to my neocortex, maybe that explained that amnesia. And yet all the memories came back. In fact, within 2 months, my memories had returned. And we describe all this in Living in a Mindful Universe, but had returned to a point where they were more refined and complete than they had been before the coma. And I knew that from deep conversations about distant events with family and close friends that occurred both before coma and after coma, and realized my memory was more complete after this kind of recovery of memory. It's a much deeper mystery than that. And also I would say that early reflection that maybe that was the best consciousness my brain could muster while it was soaking in pus, really doesn't bear out the bigger literature review that I've done. For example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about the bardos, and that's a kind of a primitive, dark level that our souls often have to traverse in this journey. But again, I tell people, never fear, even if you have to pass through that kind of a region, because ultimately these journeys are very beautiful, and you rise up into the spiritual world of kind of reuniting with higher souls, soul groups, that God force of bathing in that ocean of love. I mean, every bit of it, that's where they go. And in fact, when you look at large numbers of near-death experiences in modern series, you find that only about 3 to 5% of them are distressing or hellish NDEs. If I had just gone to the earthworm's eye view and come back to this world, I probably would have described it as something that sounded like a hellish NDE. And I will tell you that those can be just as beautifully transformative as all of those positive NDEs. So and I think also some of the hellish NDEs come from people who were very busy handing out pain and suffering to others in their lifetime. Because when you go through a life review, the life review is experienced from all viewpoints, not just your own. So that everyone that you impacted with your actions and thoughts, it comes back at you. You feel it from their perspective. It's kind of like the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe.
We recently had Mark Gober on this show, and he has a page in his book where the golden rule is actually in every single religion. And it makes sense because if we are all the same stuff, then what we do to other people, we're actually doing to ourselves. And what a beautiful built-in mechanism to learn these lessons if we have a life review and we experience what we've done to other people or the energy of what we've done to other people.
Exactly. Well, I think it's very helpful in what it does over time, because another key concept here is that our souls do come back again and again. With reincarnation is scientifically validated beyond any reasonable doubt through the work of Ian Stevenson, Jim Tucker, University of Virginia, UVADOPS.org, Jim Matlock, Carol Bowman, and others. I mean, there's no doubt that we come back, but as those investigators will tell you, those memories usually disappear by age 6 or 7. And that's why most of us, because of the amnesia of childhood, where we don't remember readily those events at age 2, 3, and 4, but we also don't remember the memories we had of past lives and between lives. But when you get into the scientific literature on reincarnation, it's absolutely part of human reality. We just need to understand better how it works.
I think the president of the American Statistical Association, it's a woman, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her.
Jessica Utz.
There you go. Yeah. She said, look, if this was any other branch of medicine, it would be completely accepted as beyond proven. But because there's this bias, it's and can we talk a bit about that bias? Why? And I heard you interviewed on Buddha at the Gas Pump. Rick Archer was actually a guest of the show several weeks ago. But he asked the question, why is it they fight so hard to not see evidence that's right there in front of them?
Well, you got to remember that people, spend their academic careers, their, professional reputation depends a lot on what they've written and talked about and the positions they've taken. And if you're, 2 or 3 decades into that kind of a career in pure materialism, and other people are talking about this incredible evidence for a totally opposite worldview, that no, the brain does not create consciousness, that it's a filter or transceiver that allows this primordial, unified mind to come in. And we have this little eddy current of that because the brain is filtering in only a certain amount that kind of applies to our, needs as this soul living this life. That's where the whole thing starts to them to be very threatening. And also it's kind of hard to measure a lot of this stuff. Our modern science is absolutely, built on measuring, things in the physical world, in space and time, and looking for correlations of events and trying to use the worlds of physics, chemistry, and biology to have a scientific understanding of the nature of reality. And yet what you find, there's something called the hard problem of consciousness. It was first defined by David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, in his 1996 book, Conscious Mind. And that challenge, when you really get deeply into it, you realize there is no way you can simply march from the neural correlates of consciousness and measure what's going on in the brain and then figure out what's going on in conscious phenomenal experience. It does not work at all. And in fact, when you move beyond just the hard problem in the neuroscience and also philosophy of mind, something called the binding problem, which is the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual, which is very tough to explain from the materialist position of all these different neuronal populations contributing to give you consciousness.
So the hard problem is where do we find consciousness in the brain? Is that correct?
Well, no, there actually is an easy problem. The easy problem of consciousness is what's going on in the brain that gets me a perception of the color red, or the smell of a gardenia, or the emotional truth of falling in love. What is the neural correlate that gives you that kind of effect?
And you used to test that stuff all the time, so you're intimately familiar with what parts of the brain are responsible for which kinds of thoughts.
And most of modern scientists, at least a decade ago, were estimating that the easy problem could be solved in maybe a century. But they thought the hard problem may be completely insoluble. And in fact, they're right. It's not soluble from a materialist position.
Tell our listeners what the hard problem is.
Sorry?
Tell our listeners what our hard problem is.
Well, the hard problem is that there's no way to connect neural correlates to phenomenal experience and to this global kind of sense of our oneness of consciousness.
There is, and in simpler language, where is consciousness coming from? Is that simpler language for all of that?
That might be, and it turns out consciousness turns out to be what's called an ontological primitive. Now, before my coma as a materialist neuroscientist, that ontological primitive was the physical world, and so we look at everything going on in the physical world. I'll give you a concrete example about this very problem for neuroscience. In the last 12 years, there have been a number of papers that came out. In fact, one of them is referenced in the book Proof of Heaven, even though the text description reference to that paper was stripped out by editors before it was published. They didn't want too much science in there because they said I was writing for an 8th grade average reader. So that was that. But I mentioned this, and then there have been several papers since then that are the very same thing. And what it is looking at people under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms. Anybody who's ever taken magic mushrooms know they cause tremendous kind of phenomenological experience. And most people would think, my gosh, my brain must be lighting up like a Christmas tree with this substance. Same with LSD, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, active principle ayahuasca. And all of those substances have been studied using functional MRI, using magnetoencephalography, some of the best techniques we have of looking at the action of the brain, all those neurons and their networks. And what you find, surprisingly enough, is that with these substances, the brain is going dark. It's getting out of the way. The default mode network, which is made up of parts of the frontal cortex and especially association parietal cortex, and is generally thought to be kind of our sense of the daydreaming ego self existing in the moment, that whole default mode network is completely dissolved. There is no neuronal population anywhere in the brain that increases in activity. So they're all just kind of getting out of the way.
So everybody's having this amazing experience and the brain is turned down or off.
Yeah, the brain is not doing it.
How exciting.
And that's why neuroscience alone will never give you the answers about consciousness. That's why in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we use neuroscience, hard problem of consciousness. We use that philosophy of mind, the binding problem, as I said, that unity of consciousness that in the individual that's so hard to explain from a materialist position. We use all the evidence for non-local consciousness from parapsychology, telepathy as an example. Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, 35% of identical twins have powerful, provable telepathic experiences. Telepathy is absolutely real. Someone who tells you it's not simply hasn't done their homework. And then, of course, the big key, and this, again, is part of our argument for the primordial mind and living in a mindful universe, is quantum physics. Because ultimately, the deepest lesson of quantum physics, as it's tried to show us for the last 100 years, is that consciousness is primordial in the universe. And
I heard you.
This is where
I
it's
heard
very
you
exciting.
quoting Heisenberg. He has a terrific quote about taking the first sip. And would you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, I love that. And Werner Heisenberg, of course, a very renowned quantum physicist. He came up with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is absolutely crucial to this understanding because it applies at the level of ion channels and synaptic vesicles in the brain. Those are all completely subject to Heisenberg's uncertainty. And that's how top-down causality, mind over matter, works. But the quote is, and he won that Nobel Prize in 1932, so a very respectable Nobel laureate. He said, the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will lead you towards atheism, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you.
And
I
that's
absolutely
you
love that.
can't separate the observer from the observed, which gets really exciting because just by observing something, and you mentioned something really interesting because you talked about the brain as a reducing valve, and when you look at the fact that when we look, the human vision only picks up a very small amount of the visual field that's out there. Our ears only pick up a very small amount of what's out there. Our conscious minds are only processing 40 bits per second, while our subconscious mind is processing 40 million bits per second. So what we're aware of is so teensy tiny, and you
Right.
described it as a reducing valve.
Well, this is why meditation and centering prayer are so important. Because once you realize your brain, your mind, your phenomenal experience is not simply the subject of electrochemical reactions in your brain, in the moment, sitting here between your ears, but telepathy, remote viewing, all these other examples of non-local consciousness, distance healing, power of prayer, and then you've got this whole category of near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death in many ways, but they happen to perfectly healthy people. And then all the after-death communications that probably occur in more than half of our population. All of this tremendous body of evidence shows us without doubt that we're sharing this one mind. And this is where our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, can make such an important statement about that primordial consciousness and the brain as a filter. And likewise, Larry Dossey's book, The One Mind, Steve Taylor's book, Spiritual Science, all three of these, and plus I would argue, as Pim Van Lommel does in his BigelowInstitute.org essay, second place winner in the Bigelow contest, proving the afterlife from a scientific perspective. Pim Van Lommel also, in addition to those three resources, mentions a paper by Bernardo Castro, the Universe in Consciousness, that came out, I think, Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2018. But these are all resources, very profound scientific arguments for the oneness of mind and the brain as a filter. And this is so important to understand these bigger concepts of things like the afterlife, perceptions, reincarnation. Every bit of it starts to, become more realistic as we explore these theoretical models and all this empirical data. And it leads us to this beautiful notion of the reality, how NDEs are the tip of the spear. And I will point out that more than 90% of people who have had near-death experiences across history, across all continents, millennia, what have you, more than 90% come back not just believing, but knowing in this loving force of benevolence at the core of the universe that is so apparent to them deep in these journeys. And it's not as if they're finding Satan there at the deepest, they're finding pure love. And that's why it's so important to recognize that our souls, our kind of spiritual unity, is truly one of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance. This is where we can truly succeed as souls. to let that little ego mind. The ego uses fear and anxiety. The ego is right there at the heart of addictions, not just to substances, but addictions to sex, addiction to love, addiction to work, addiction to exercise. Addiction can take many forms, but it's really at heart, it's kind of your ego making these demands that ultimately do not help your bigger soul experience. And this is why meditation, centering prayer for me is always going in. I let my ego voice state a request, make an intention, but then I dive deep with those sacred acoustics tones into meditation that allows me to kind of connect with that higher soul and that primordial mind. And it's tremendously helpful and healing to do that kind of thing.
Beautiful. Love that. Yeah, I do help with people with addictions as well. And I describe it as that hole that you are trying to fill with whatever it is, whether it's shopping, sex, drugs, whatever, and you can't fill it with that stuff. The filling has to come from within, and as you're describing,
be spiritual in nature.
Yeah,
it's not material.
Yep, and turning down the mind that doesn't have the answers and connecting to all that is so rich. So Dr. Alexander, I just interviewed somebody who, when I heard the story, I knew I had to share it. It hasn't gone public yet. But this fellow was in a coma for 22 days.
What was the cause of his coma?
They're actually not exactly sure. He was out with friends and something occurred, and he ended up in the hospital.
Probably some kind of head trauma.
Could be, likely.
Or some substance.
But he was offline. In fact, the hospital wanted to harvest his brain. And for 3 weeks they had taken MRIs, and there's some parallels to your story, which I think are so important. You had tremendous community support around you, and your wife actually had reached out to somebody to connect with you, and that person came back with some important messages as to how to interact with you while you were in the hospital bed. So you were well attended for that period of time that you were in the hospital bed, completely unresponsive, and your wife was told to be by the bedside with you, instructing you that you had the ability to come back, and it wasn't your time to go yet. Can you talk about how important that is? Because again, I'm struck by the parallels between your story and this young fellow's story, because he was beloved by his community, and people, this was during COVID, just showed up at the hospital day after day after day after day, even though they couldn't be in the room with him, couldn't talk to him, he was laying in a bed like you were, strapped down, with a ventilator, unresponsive. How important is that to have that beautiful, all those souls around you, loving you, connecting with you, giving you a helping hand to return and share this amazing story with others?
Okay, it's important to point out we're going to skip forward through a lot of my story. There's a tremendous amount there about what I call the Gateway Valley, all the earth-like features, spiritual features, and then ascending to higher levels all the way to core, infinite inky blackness, but was a pure oneness where all dualities are resolved. There's much more to the story, but then as we get towards the very end, we're getting to the part you're asking me about. And the very, very end, after all these beautiful occurrences, is where for one thing, I'd been told that when I first entered that core realm, the sanctum sanctorum of the divine, the deepest I went, that I wasn't there to stay, that I'd be going back, but that I'd be taught many things. And there came a time, though, where I would oscillate through these various levels of the spiritual realm, using music, vibration, frequency, the memory of that to help me navigate. And at the very end of it all, I saw 6 faces. And this is at a point where I tried to use the musical notes to conjure up my light pathway portal coming up into the Gateway Valley in the core, and it didn't work. And so I was now back down to where they kind of promised I would end up, and I didn't know what that was all about. And that's when I saw the 6 faces around me. And the 6 faces were very important. Because, in fact, 5 of them were people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma. And very notably, many other family and friends who had been there earlier in the week, I had no memory of. And as I point out in the book Proof of Heaven, the timing of all this is such that it proved to me that the vast majority of the spiritual journey that I described had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of a 7-day coma. And the 4 or 5 part has to do with who you're referring to, Susan Rinches, a family friend. I'd first met her in freshman English in UNC Chapel Hill in 1972. We were friends. Then we lost track of each other. Then years later, she was teaching with my former spouse at a school in Raleigh, North Carolina. They became very good friends. And what my former spouse and her friend Sylvia, who was also at the bedside, one of those faces I saw coming out of coma, they remembered that Susan had done this work called channeling. Now, of course, if you'd asked me about channeling before my coma, I would have said it's a bunch of hooey nonsense. Well, guess what? She was there front and center in my experience as one of those 6 faces. And Susan was never within 120 miles of me physically. She was down in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in her home. She'd been contacted by my family. I'm in a coma and not expected to survive. Can you do anything to help? And so Susan would come to me in this kind of channel state. And she was very reassuring and soothing, just like the other faces of the people who were physically there. She helped to bring me back to this world. And I remember I met up with Susan about 6 months after all this. And she said it was one of the scariest episodes she'd ever had. She wrote a book about a lot of this called Third Eye Open, which I can highly recommend to people. But in her experiences, she used the analogy, it was kind of like an oasis in a desert. And she said she'd walk up, there was a rope coming out of a well in the oasis, and she'd start pulling on the rope. And normally she'd start pulling and she could feel some resistance because the soul was still there on the other end of the rope. But in my case, she said, and she'd channeled to many people in coma, many of whom had gone on to die. And yet she said my case was one of the worst she could ever remember, where she pulled on the rope and there was nothing still there. And she thought I was already gone. And she worked very hard on these mantras, as you said, telling my spouse and others to repeat these to me. And I think they were very important in bringing me back to this world. And
so when
when
she pulled on the rope and you were gone, how did she know, or how did she sense that there was still some possibility there to reach you?
There was just the glimmer, the least amount of resistance that maybe there was something still there. But she said I was very far gone from this world. And that certainly matches the medical facts in that medical case report. This was not a kind of a moderate or a severe case of meningitis. This was an extreme, deadly, should have killed me case of meningitis. And Susan sensed the very same thing on the 4th and 5th nights of my coma when she channeled to me. So I'm very grateful. And I'll point out another thing, and this I mentioned in the book Proof of Heaven, but it has to do with your question of having a supportive crowd. I remember when that first night I was in coma on November 10th, my older son Eben had driven down from college, got there about 11:15 that night, and he was just horribly distraught. My sister Phyllis arrived, and when she got there, there was no one there. The nurse had stepped out for a minute, and she just saw me there on the ventilator, and she then made some deal with the nurses that somebody in the family could be there holding my hand 24/7, and to the extent that they could honor that, the nurses were very wonderful about honoring that request. So I had a family member there 24/7 holding my hand, giving me that love, that sense of connection to this world. So in spite of this horrific illness that should have killed me, I believe it was those beautiful connections through Susan's channeling, through my loved ones, at the bedside, and all the prayers that were said. I even had a vision of thousands of beings going off around me into the distance as I realized I could no longer ascend to the core, the Gateway Valley and the core, after multiple passes through there. And yet that's what I sensed was this power of prayer. All these beings going off in the distance. And the amazing thing about that was it occurred back in that kind of murky earthworm eye view. And yet I felt the same sense of spiritual home, of belonging, of comfort, of love, and bathing in that ocean of acceptance and purpose with the universe. And I sensed it from the kind of energy of these beings around me who were kind of murmuring, and I call it the power of prayer when I came back to this world, because that's basically what I sensed is going on, and that's what helped to guide me back to this world.
In this experience with this fellow waking up after 22 days, and I'd love to actually connect you guys, and if you're interested in looking at his MRI, since you're such an expert, I'm curious to see what your input would be. But the hospital was quite determined to harvest his brain after 3 weeks and said, there's nothing there, there's nothing there. The father had had a near-death experience himself, so he was aware of this in-between state that one can go to. So he communicated with the son, and he said, look, if you want to go, he says, I understand it can be a delicious, beautiful experience, and I understand that, but if you want to come back, give me a sign, track your eyes from left to right. And he got the eye tracking.
Right.
And so through Joe Dispenza's group, he set up a global coherence healing and happened to end up with a very large one because somebody had dropped out of a study that was being done. And so there was like 50 healers on the call, including the son's friends, because the father made sure that happened. And so this happened on a Friday, and then it happened on a Monday. And then the kids were all in the room. The tube was taken out, and this again, the hospital was hours away from harvesting the brain.
Right.
And the kids were making fun of him. They said, hey, remember that time? And they were chiding him and loud, and so they heard him cough. And the friend said, well, that's him. That's Logan. He's trying to come back. And so the father takes his cell phone. I mean, this is like a Hollywood movie that just they'd throw away the script because it just couldn't happen. They stick the cell phone in the guy in Logan's face and says, Logan, tell your mother you love her, because she was on the other end of the FaceTime, and Logan flutters his eyes and says, love you, Mom.
That is so beautiful. Well, there's no question that kind of healing, distance healing, can be very powerful, and power of prayer too. I mean, it's beautiful as we start to realize and accept that this kind of spiritual nature of our being and the spiritual nature of the universe allow for this kind of tremendous healing, bringing us back into wholeness, and that we can influence others and help in their healing too. So this
do you often
beautiful
feel like,
community is very useful.
Do you often feel like Galileo or Copernicus, where you've seen something completely different and it's like, I'm sure you're familiar with Occam's razor.
Certainly.
Yeah. So there's all this scientific evidence out there. I mean, that its p-values are incredible. It's 1 in a bazillion that this could be anything other than what it is, which is that
Right.
consciousness isn't located in the brain, and we are these magnificent, incredible spiritual beings. And you, as a neuro, brain surgeon, what a great gift it is for you to come back and say, hey, this is reality. I mean,
Right.
what a beautiful gift you have to give the world.
Well, it is. And the interesting thing is some people think this is kind of a religion versus science, or spirituality versus science. It turns out that the science is some of the best support I've had. The scientific community, especially because of the facts, the medical details of my case that make it crystal clear this could not be, just some random dream or hallucination. And not only that, that healing and coming into wholeness after this kind of illness needs an explanation. And you can't just say, well, every now and then this happens, especially to have that extraordinary experience that's then associated with this kind of healing. So it's, in fact, what I would recommend to people, go to GalileoCommission.org, go to scientificandmedical.net. These are two groups. I'm a scientific advisor for both of them. You'll realize that the scientific community is far along this pathway of understanding. And it's because materialism, the conventional kind of Newtonian deterministic science that so many of us learned in school and then have put into practice in our lives, turns out it doesn't work at all to explain the brain-mind connection. As I said earlier, Heisenberg uncertainty principle is absolutely functional right there at all the ion channels and synaptic vesicles in the brain, because they're down at that tiny atomic and subatomic level. And this is where that top-down causality and kind of the bigger one-mind hypothesis with the brain as a filter starts to make tremendous sense, just as we argue in Living in a Mindful Universe. But there are scientific books on these topics that go even further for the really deep dive. For anybody out there who thinks they're up to the challenge, and I promise you it's well worth it, you can read the books of Ed Kelly. He's at University of Virginia. He's edited 3 powerful books on consciousness. The first was Irreducible Mind in 2007, and then came Beyond Physicalism in 2015, and finally that incredible capstone to the current trilogy, Consciousness Unbound, which came out, I believe, in March of 2021. And these books, written by multiple scientists who have, half century each of experience in this field, make it crystal clear that materialism died long ago. Quantum physics actually was the end of that kind of misunderstanding of the brain-mind connection. And quantum physics is especially the Nobel Prize in 2022 for entanglement. Entanglement is all about the mental layer of the universe. It leaves behind our conventional notions of four-dimensional space-time as the theater on which all information transfer in this universe occurs. And we realize that at that mental layer, it's much deeper interconnections. And of course, near-death experiences, you get right into that mental layer of the universe. That's where you reconnect with souls who have left the physical plane, souls who might be at a distance still in their body, and that God force. You review your life, birth, death, everything in between can be witnessed simultaneously. I mean, that realm offers us tremendous insight into the nature of reality. And it's one of the reasons why, for materialists to just debunk and deny this evidence and say can't be, it doesn't fit our materialistic models, is just a giant headache in the making. Because ultimately, by rejecting data, just as Carl Sagan said,
yes,
we are not smart enough to know what data is to be suppressed.
Well, Carl Sagan also he rejected the information until. Was it Rupert Sheldrake or he was asked to look at some information or he commented on information and said it was completely bogus and fake. And then the scientists who he was poo-pooing basically said, well, you can say this publicly, but you actually have to read my material first. And then he read the material and it completely flipped his reality. He's like, oh, wow, this actually is completely verifiable.
As I recall, that's on page 302 of Sagan's book, The Demon Haunted World.
Ooh, good.
And there were actually three specific items, categories of investigation, where he said they need further investigation. One of those was all the reincarnation work, Ian Stevenson's work, which has been duplicated, replicated, proven beyond any reasonable doubt. And I think the other was on telepathy, maybe the Gansfield kind of dream projection telepathy experiments. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of blocking. I don't want to say anything that's too far off base, but there was a third.
I think telekinesis was the other one.
What?
Telekinesis?
Yeah, probably so. That would make sense.
Or precognition. Precognition. It was one of those.
Precognition, absolutely. And Daryl Bem and the meta-analysis that he's done, precognition is absolutely a real part. That's one of the things that Jessica Utz also said, yep, it's real, statistically, scientifically, absolutely validated, but because it touches on nerves, that people, oh my God, that implies spirituality and God. No, we can't have that as part of science. Sorry, folks, it's part of science. If you want to understand the real world, we must look at this much bigger picture of reality outside of materialistic preconceptions.
And to this day, I mean, most of our scientific journals haven't openly looked at this and reported about it because it does completely flip the paradigm that we have been living under.
I'm going to give your viewers a resource, bigelowinstitute.org. And if you go to bigelowinstitute.org, you'll find 28 essays that were written 2 years ago in a contest. And they were written by groups of scientists, all of whom had demonstrated at least 5 years of serious, rigorous scientific experience researching the afterlife question. And the question was simply, what's the best scientific evidence for continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? And you'll find those 28 essays that answer that question. Many of them are deeply scientific. I can especially recommend Pim Van Lommel. He wrote the second place essay. Bernardo Kastrup, an incredible, he's a big supporter of our book. In fact, they all are, of Living in a Mindful Universe. But Kastrup wrote one. Julie Beischel wrote an excellent scientific paper on mediumship in a quintuply blinded study from winbridge.org. And Dean Radin from Noetic Sciences. So start reading those papers and you'll realize absolutely the afterlife and reincarnation are real, period. Scientifically proven. It's no longer a question of whether these are true or not. They're absolutely real. And any scientist who claims otherwise must also claim, oh, well, no, I haven't looked at any of those papers. I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to put out there as, a theoretical physicist like Sean Carroll, oh, no, there's no such thing as the afterlife because we haven't discovered a spiritual particle. He obviously needs to pay much more attention to the measurement paradox and the participatory anthropic principle of John Wheeler that imply absolutely the role of mind over matter, and that it's not mind that's derivative from matter, it's that matter in the physical universe emerges from the mental.
Yeah.
So go to bigelowinstitute.org. You'll realize that any scientist trying to tell you that this near-death experiences and afterlife issues are woo-woo nonsense, that those people simply haven't done their homework, and they're speaking from a position of willful ignorance,
Yeah.
which I would not recommend paying attention to.
Mark Gober talks a lot about this in An End to Upside Down Thinking. Are you familiar with his book at all?
I love Mark's work. Yeah,
I love him.
Yeah, I absolutely love his books. We communicated a bunch early on when he was getting ready to put out The End of Upside Down Thinking. And
I have all of his books in front of me, autographed by him. I adore him.
Excellent. Yeah, Mark's a wonderful soul to be contributing to this, because he came at it from kind of a different direction, but a very rational, logical mind. And boy, he does a great job of making the case.
Yep. Oh boy, this is so exciting. It feels. I know you're familiar with Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, and
we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and it's so exciting to be living in this time. It's like, the Galileo and Copernicus, and they just completely. It's even more deep and personal than that, because you can't get any more personal than human consciousness. I mean, that's all we have.
That's it. That's the only thing anyone has ever known, is the inside of their own consciousness. Now, we think there's a world out there, a physical world, and yet what quantum physics screams at us, and acknowledged by the Nobel Committee in 2022 by giving out that prize to 3 scientists for entanglement, is that mind is fundamental. Mind generates all of emergent reality, and the more we can learn how to interact with that knowledge, and this is where I highly recommend meditation, centering prayer. And my own tool for that is sacredacoustics.com if you want to learn more about that, binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And of course, Karen Newell, the co-founder of that meditation company, Sacred Acoustics, is also the co-author of my book, of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and she's been my life partner for the last 12 years. So we're all in this together, and meditation is a beautiful clue to anyone who has trouble with anxiety or depression, or wanting to learn more about consciousness and this beautiful revolution, connect with souls of departed loved ones, etc. Just pay attention to what we're saying in Living in a Mindful Universe. Start using Sacred Acoustics, and you'll find an incredible power open up to you about kind of connecting with your higher soul and with souls of departed loved ones, and coming into a more meaningful sense of shared purpose and meaning with the universe at large.
And again, mention the resources that people can go to. I believe you have also some free downloads there that people can experience the binaural beats that you're offering.
Well, absolutely. In fact, there's a peer-reviewed scientific study supporting Sacred Acoustics for use in severe anxiety in a busy New York City, Manhattan practice. And that was published in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. I think it was January of 2020, by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. In that study, she found that over 2 weeks, Sacred Acoustics gave a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms in her very anxious Manhattan population, versus only a 7% reduction in those who only received standard talk psychotherapy for anxiety over those 2 weeks. So scientific study at least telling you, wow, this stuff has great effect against anxiety. But of course, if you go to Sacred Acoustics website, you'll find a tremendous amount of testimonials, etc., showing you far broader uses of spiritual exploration. But the reason I mention it is that the Whole Mind Bundle is a package available at Sacred Acoustics. That's the bundle that was used in that scientific study, very effectively proven to alleviate anxiety. And that bundle, early in the pandemic, Karen she reduced the price, I think, to $19, which was a true bargain for that bundle. But she also, because she knew of the tragedy of the pandemic and the economic collapse, she wanted to make it free to people who couldn't pay $19. So there's still a free button there so that people, if they don't have the financial means, they can download the Whole Mind Bundle and start taking advantage of this beautiful tool for alleviating anxiety.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, because I'm a guest on a lot of podcasts, and I love to give away resources that are effective and affordable. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks to Karen and Sacred Acoustics. They're the ones who did that. And she just, she just figured she wanted to do some good for the world. And if that meant giving it away for free, fine, do it. And I think, a lot of people have used it. So another resource I would recommend between Karen and myself, and this is Karen's brilliance, of course, all of it is, she came up with innersanctumcenter.com. That's INNER, sanctumcenter.com. And if people go there and explore, you'll find there are multiple avenues of investigation. There's a mental health practitioner course there that uses Sacred Acoustics, has Dr. Anna Yusum and myself and Karen teaching that course. There's also a series of webinars that Karen and I do monthly with our fans, and those are available there. Also, a set of interviews we did for more than 2 years, every 2 weeks during the pandemic, because we weren't going around seeing all of our wonderful friends, global thought leaders in consciousness, other experiencers, etc. And so we interviewed them in Zoom protocol, and all those interviews are available at innersanctumcenter.com. And so I would highly recommend that resource to people. Of course, sacredacoustics.com, ebenalexander.com, EBEN Alexander.com. My reading list, the FAQ page, the blog postings. There are a tremendous number of interviews, audio, video. So there's a lot of information available on all these sites to help people really get up to speed on this kind of understanding.
Thank you so much. I could talk to you for a week. I'm so excited about all the common connections we have, and love it, love it, love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, for being on Next Level Healing. Any last minute things that you'd like to offer?
Yes, I'd like to remind people that we are truly, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out in his book on scientific revolutions, we're in the middle of a scientific revolution. You don't have to wait for the whole scientific community and the culture at large to get on board. You can enjoy the benefits of this tremendous soul growth, kind of connection with the spiritual nature of the universe, enhancement of your life, appreciation of the binding force of love as the healing power. So start doing it. Start meditating. Check out these websites I've mentioned. Keep in touch with us. We love communication. And just enjoy the revolution. It's going to be a tremendous boon for humanity. It'll make this planet a far more peaceful, harmonious, and loving place. And we will start being proper stewards of the planet. Instead of succumbing to the corporate greed that has fueled the climate crisis and plastic pollution, warfare, the military-industrial complex, we will start focusing our human efforts on love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance for all. And believe me, it's a wonderful healer for the individual as well as for the world at large.
Beautiful. Love it. Quantum physics has so much to offer us. How we treat others is how we treat ourselves. And as Mark Gober and yourself point out, if you honor and love others the way you would honor and love yourself, then you can't help but have a better world and the planet.
Thanks for having me on, Tara. Great talking with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. And folks, if you got value from this, please click like and subscribe, and we will see you on the next episode of Next Level Healing.